A barefoot twin pleaded with the cook, "If you stay, can we call you Mama?" The pan was already on the fire when she got there. That's the first thing I remember. Not her face, not the sound of the wagon pulling away the pan. Cast iron, older than anything else in the kitchen, handle wrapped in burlap someone had tied on years before I got the place. She'd found it hanging on the nail above the stove, set it over the heat, and had 3 strips of salt pork curling in it before I even made it in from the corral. I stood in the doorway with my hat in my hand, and she didn't look up. Just said, "There's enough for 4 if your boys get in from wherever they've gone to." I said I'd go get them. She said, "I know." I don't know what I expected. Hector Janes, who ran the dry goods in Odell, had told me she was a cook, that she'd worked the camp kitchens in the territories, and before that kept house for a copper mining family outside of Prescott, that the family had moved east and she hadn't gone with them, that she was looking for work and not much else. Hector had said it the way a man says a thing he doesn't fully believe, like he was reading from a letter someone else had written. I'd said fine and sent word, and she'd shown up 2 weeks later on the stage with a canvas bag, a Dutch oven in a flour sack, and a look on her face like she'd made a decision she intended to keep. Her name was Nora Fenn. She was, I don't know, 40, maybe 42. She had brown hair going silver at the temples and hands that were red at the knuckles from years of hot water and cold mornings. She wasn't a woman men looked at the way they looked at some women. She was the kind of woman you noticed after a while, the way you notice a thing that turns out to be useful, except that's not right either because it wasn't that. It was more like, once you'd seen what she was, you couldn't understand how you'd missed it. But I didn't know any of that yet, standing in that doorway with the pork fat snapping in the pan. I went and got my boys. Their names were Cal and Everett. They were 8. Twins, though you'd have to look to see it. Cal was heavier through the shoulders and had his mother's eyes dark brown, nearly black. Everett was thinner and moved quick, always ahead of where you expected him to be. They'd been born in the November of the year their mother and I had come out to the Coldwater spread, which meant they'd never known a winter without wind and they'd never known a house that wasn't this one. They'd been 5 when their mother died. Fever. Summer. Quick. I don't say more than that because there's nothing more to say that doesn't just hurt without purpose. What I'll say is that for 3 years I had cooked for them badly, burned things, undercooked things, produced meals that were nourishing in the way that mud is nourishing to a creek bank, and not much more than that. I had a woman come in twice a week from town, Dottie Harker, who was 60 and kind, and who left food in the cold room that I could put on the stove. But Dottie's husband had taken sick in the spring and she'd stopped coming. I needed someone permanent. I needed someone who would live on the place. I want to say I hired Nora Fenn for the boys. That's mostly true. The first 3 weeks she was there, she rebuilt the kitchen. Not the walls, not the fixtures, the way it worked. Moved the flour barrel to the north corner where it was cooler. Nailed 2 extra hooks above the stove. Traded the bent-handle ladle I'd been using for 8 years for a straight one she produced from her canvas bag, as if she'd known the bent one would be there. She never asked about any of it. She just looked at how things were and adjusted them, the same way you'd reset a fence post that had worked loose without making an announcement about it. Cal and Everett watched her the way cats watch a new thing, from a distance at first, then closer, then suddenly right underfoot. By the end of the 2nd week, Everett was sitting on the flour barrel every morning while she made biscuits, not saying anything, just watching her hands. By the end of the 3rd week, Cal had figured out that if he asked her questions she'd answer them, and he asked her everything. Where had she come from? What was the biggest thing she'd ever cooked? Had she ever seen a man get shot? Could she ride a horse? Did she like dogs? And she answered each one straight, without making it smaller or larger than it was, and when she didn't know something she said so. I watched all this from outside the kitchen mostly. I ate what she put in front of me. I said thank you and meant it. I kept to the work of the ranch the way I always had. She was there maybe 6 weeks when I came in at noon and found her and the boys at the table together, All three of them bent over something. It was a map. Cal had drawn it, a map of the ranch as he understood it, which was only approximately correct, and Nora was asking him questions about it, pointing to places he'd marked and saying, "What's this? What's here?" And Cal was explaining with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who has been asked to be the expert, and Everett was leaning over and correcting him when he got it wrong, and Nora was nodding at each correction like she was filing it away. I stood at the door again with my hat in my hand. Nobody looked up. I'd had the Coldwater spread for 12 years. Started with nothing much, a quarter section, a mortgaged horse, more ambition than sense. I'd built it into something real. Not big by some men's measure, but real 300 head of decent Hereford crosses, 30 acres under hay, a bunkhouse that held 4 hands regular, a main house that was dry and tight and solid. I'd done it by working the kind of hours that don't leave room for other things. That was fine when Helen was alive. Helen had been the room I came back to. She was good and strong, and she understood what I was building and why, and she was patient with the hours because she could see what they were for. When she died, I kept working the same hours out of something that wasn't ambition anymore, more like I didn't know how to be still. The boys needed feeding, and I fed them. The cattle needed working, and I worked them. The seasons came in, and I met them. I don't think I was unhappy. I didn't think about it much. The thing about grief is that it fills up all the space for a while, and then when it starts to drain off, it leaves a kind of flatness where you don't much feel one thing or another, and after a while you mistake that flatness for who you are. I'd mistaken it for who I was. Thought I was a man who just wasn't made for much besides the work and the boys. Thought maybe that was all right. Thought that was the shape of things from here on. Nora Fenn had been on the place 2 months when Tom Riddle came by. Tom Riddle ran the R over the ridge to the east of me, which was 6 times the size of the Coldwater, and had been in his family since before the war. Tom was not a bad man, but he was a man who had grown up being told what he was worth by the number of acres under his name, and that had given him a particular quality, a sort of smoothness that was less courtesy than management. He came by on a Tuesday morning in September, hat in hand, sat at my table, and said he'd been hearing good things about my cook, and was wondering if she might be available for the R. Nora was in the kitchen. She could hear us. I said she was under contract with me. She wasn't. There was no contract. She worked for a wage and a room, and she could leave whenever she chose, and Tom Riddle almost certainly knew that. He smiled the smile of a man who has learned to be polite about the things he wants, and said she'd be well compensated, that the R had a proper kitchen with a range and 3 full-time girls to help, that it was a significant step up from. And here he looked around my kitchen the way men look at things they're pricing, from what she had here. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said he'd have to ask her himself. Tom called through the doorway, asked her to come out, which she did with a dish towel in her hand. He explained the offer. She stood and listened to all of it with her face still. When he finished, she said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Riddle. I'll stay where I am." Tom said, "Mrs. Fenn, I'm prepared to offer." She said, "I'll stay where I am." He left. I sat at the table for a moment after the sound of his horse faded out, and then I went back to work without saying anything to her, because I didn't have words for what I wanted to say, and I knew better than to start talking when I didn't have words yet. That evening she put a roast on the table. Good one. First good roast we'd had since Dottie Harker stopped coming. The boys ate until they were stupid with it. I ate plenty myself. I said it was very good. She said thank you and cleared the plates. October came cold. There was a week of rain that turned the yard to mud and kept the boys in the house, which meant they were underfoot constantly, which meant Nora had 2 wet, cabin-fevered 8-year-olds in her kitchen for 7 days running. She put them to work. Set Cal to shelling dried beans, a job that takes patience and not much skill and lasts a long time, and set Everett to sorting and stringing dried chilies, which he liked because he could make patterns. When they got restless, she told them things. Not stories exactly, more like information. About plants, about the territories, about animals. Told them that mules are smarter than horses, not dumber, and why. Told them about the way you can read weather coming off the mountains if you know what to look for. Told them what she knew about the Navajo, which was more than most people in that part of the country knew, because she'd lived near their land for 5 years and had paid attention. I came in from the barn one of those rain afternoons and sat at the table to rest my feet and ended up staying 2 hours without meaning to, just listening to her talk to the boys. Not because what she said was soft or because she was performing anything, because she talked to them like they were people. Not like they were children to be managed or hearts to be handled. Like they were people who deserved real things said to them. I thought about Helen, how she'd done that too. Then I put that thought away. There was a night in November that changed things. Not the way I would have chosen, but things don't wait for your choosing. I'd been out with my top hand, a man named Suter, working a section of fence in the southeast corner that had been coming down for a month. We got it done by dark, and I was coming back through the hollow when my horse went down, hit a hidden hole in the frozen ground and went down hard, and I went with him. Horse got up. I didn't, not right away. Left knee took the fall wrong, and when I tried to stand on it, it had nothing. I could get up, but I couldn't walk on it without the leg folding. Suter had gone ahead. It was dark and cold, and I was a mile from the house. I got on the horse and made it back because that's what you do, but by the time I got to the yard I was gray with it and barely able to get down from the saddle. The lamp was on in the kitchen. I came through the door and Nora was at the stove, and she turned and looked at me once and said, "Sit down." I sat. She had my boot off before I could think to argue about it, and she had her hands on the knee, feeling it, pressing, moving the joint a degree at a time in a way that was not rough but was not asking for permission either. She said, "It's not broken. You've twisted the whole knee. Did you hear anything pop?" I said I hadn't. She said, "Good." Then she went and got a cloth and packed it with snow from the bucket outside and put it on the knee and told me to hold it there. The boys were in bed. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. She put water on to heat and after a while brought a basin and a cloth and cleaned a gash on my forearm I hadn't noticed, working without ceremony. Her hands were steady and sure. She wasn't bothered by the blood. At some point she handed me a cup of coffee and sat down across from me and looked at me, not with worry, not with pity, just looking. Like she was checking the count of a thing, making sure it was all there. I said, "I'm all right." She said, "I can see that." We sat there a while. I said, "Why did you stay?" when Riddle offered. She looked at the cup in her hands, thought about it the way she thought about things without rush. She said, "I've worked for men like Tom Riddle, good enough men, plenty of them. The kitchen is always better, the range is always newer." She paused. "But I'd rather work for a man who says ask her yourself." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. She said, "You've built something real here, Mr. Holt. Anyone can see that. What you've done with this place, what you've done with those boys." She looked at me and her voice was level, not soft, not performing. Men don't always get told that. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Capable by men who wanted to use it. Stubborn by men who didn't. I've been respected in the way that frontier respect works, carefully, at arm's length, because men here respected what they had to and held the rest back. But this woman sat in my kitchen at 11 at night and told me she saw what I'd built, told me she'd stayed because she'd seen what kind of man I was, and said it the way you say a fact. My knee hurt. I was tired down to the marrow. I didn't have it in me to deflect it. I said, "Thank you." That was all. We sat a little while longer, and then she told me to keep weight off it for 3 days and went to bed. 3 days off the knee. She was firm about it, which meant I sat on the porch or at the kitchen table more than I'd sat anywhere in years. Suter and my other hand, a young man named Fowler, ran things without complaint. They were good men. I'd hired good men. I sat and watched the place work the way I'd built it to work, and it was a strange feeling, like seeing a thing you'd made from the outside for the first time. The boys didn't know what to do with me being still. Cal sat beside me the second morning and talked for an hour about a hawk he'd been watching near the south pasture, what it ate, where it nested, everything Nora had told him about hawks, which was apparently quite a lot. Everett brought out the map he'd been adding to, filling in the places Nora had asked about, marking the fence lines and the water holes, and spread it across my lap and explained every addition. I looked at that map. It was better, truer to the actual ground. He'd gotten Nora to help him with the proportions. I said, "This is good work, Ev." He said, "Nora showed me about the scale." There it was, Nora, not Mrs. Fenn, not the cook, just Nora, the way you'd say a name you'd said 1,000 times. Cal heard it and looked at his brother, and something went between them in the way things go between twins. Some interior agreement that passed too fast for a grown man to catch. I said I was going to get more coffee. Nora was in the kitchen. She handed me the cup before I asked. She was cutting dried apples for something, the knife going steady and sure. I stood there with the cup. She said without looking up, "Your boys are something, Mr. Holt." I said they were. She said, "Cal thinks harder than he lets on. Everett feels more than he shows. You know that." I did know it. It surprised me that she'd seen it that quickly. She said, "Their mother must have been something." I said she was. Nora nodded and kept cutting, didn't press it. Didn't make it into anything it didn't need to be. I went back to the porch with my coffee and sat in the thin November sun and thought about how a person could go years without feeling truly known. And then a woman they'd hired to cook their meals could say 4 sentences, and the whole thing would shift. The knee came right. I went back to work. December came in on a north wind that drove down hard and stayed. We settled into the winter the way you do on a working ranch, tighter hours, more lamp oil, the world shrinking down to what the cold allowed. Nora made soups that lasted 2 days, stews that improved overnight, bread twice a week. The boys ate like they'd been hollow. I ate like a man who'd been eating badly for 3 years. There were evenings. That was the thing about winter. You couldn't work past dark, which meant there were evenings, which we'd never had before, not as a, I won't say family because that word was too heavy then. As a group of people in a house together. She'd sit after supper and mend or read, and the boys would be doing whatever boys do in the lamplight, and I'd sit with the account books or just sit, and the fire would go and nobody would say much. I hadn't had evenings since Helen. I didn't examine it, I just sat in them. January, a hard one. The second week, Suitor came in from the range with news that a section of fence in the northwest corner had come down under the snow load, and we had cattle moving. I was out the door in 10 minutes with Suitor and Fowler, and we worked that fence and moved cattle in brutal cold for 2 days running, sleeping out the first night in a line camp that was weather-tight but cold, and came back on the second night half frozen and finished. Nora had the stove going red and food waiting, and she looked at all 3 of us when we came in and said, "Shed the coats, sit down, don't argue." We didn't argue. She fed Suitor and Fowler and sent them to the bunkhouse with food to take, and she fed me at the kitchen table. And when I was done, I was so tired I put my arms on the table, and my head went down without my permission. I heard her moving, the lamp turned down. A blanket came around my shoulders. She must have gone and got one from the other room, and she set it there and left me alone. When I woke, the fire had been kept up and there was fresh coffee on the stove, and it was 4 in the morning, and the house was dark and quiet, and I sat in the kitchen in the blanket with the coffee and felt, for the first time in longer than I could say, like I was in a place that was being looked after. Not the ranch. The ranch had always been looked after, I'd seen to that. I mean, I felt like I was being looked after. I sat with that a long while before I went to bed. March came. The snow pulled back and the mud came in, and then the mud dried and the grass went from brown to green in the way it does out here, sudden, like a change of mind. The boys were outside from the time the light came until I called them in. Nora put the Dutch oven away and went back to cooking things that didn't need to be kept hot for hours. I was fixing the windmill one afternoon in late March, up on the platform with a wrench and a bad opinion of whoever had installed the thing originally, when I heard them below me. The boys and Nora. They were in the yard, and I couldn't see them from where I was, but I could hear. They were doing something with the garden plot. She'd asked me in February about putting in a kitchen garden, and I'd said where and shown her the spot. Sounded like they were turning soil. Everett said something I didn't catch. Cal said, would she mind? Everett said, I don't know, just ask. Then quiet. Then Everett's voice, a little different, careful the way a child is careful when a thing matters. He said, Nora. She said, what is it? He said, if you stay, I mean if you stay here on the ranch, can we call you Mama? The wrench stopped in my hand. Long pause, the wind moved, below me nothing moved. Nora's voice came up, and it was not the even cook's voice, not the steady voice she used for facts. It was lower and it had something rougher in it, something that had gone through feeling to get to the other side. She said, you want to do that? Cal said, and I could tell by the sound that he was right up close to her, you're here every day. You know about everything. You know about us. Another pause. She said, if your father's all right with it. Cal said, he will be. I stayed on that platform for a long moment, just doing something I didn't have words for. Then I put the wrench in my belt and climbed down. They were in the garden plot, all three of them, and they looked up when they heard me. Nora's face was something I'd never seen on her before, not soft exactly, but open, like a thing that had been held in for a while had been set down. I said I heard. She looked at me, still the way she was still sometimes. I said, I think it's a good idea. Everett said, see, to Cal. Cal walked over and took my hand, the way he'd done since he was small, the particular way where he didn't look up, just found my hand and held it. Everett went back to Nora, and without ceremony or explanation, put himself against her side, and started pulling at weeds in the garden dirt like the whole matter was settled. Maybe it was. Nora looked at me over Everett's head, and what was in her face was simple and clear. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. Recognition. The same thing she'd said in the kitchen in November. She saw what this place was. She saw what I'd made of it. She was choosing to be part of it, not because she had nowhere else to go, she'd proved she had choices, but because she'd looked at what was here and decided it was worth staying for. I held my boy's hand and looked back at her, and for the first time in a long time felt the full weight of what I'd built, not just the fences and the cattle and the hay ground, but all of it. All of it. That's most of the story. There's more after, there's always more after. She did stay. We were married that fall in the yard on a Saturday morning, Suitor and Fowler standing up for me, the boys in their good shirts that she'd mended twice each that summer. It was a plain thing. That suited us both. What I'd say, if I was going to say anything about it, is this. I spent a lot of years thinking I knew what I was. Rancher. Father. A man who got things done and expected nothing extra and asked nothing from the world except fair weather and honest work. Thought that was a fine enough shape for a life. Maybe it was. But there's a difference between a man who knows what he's worth because he's counted it up for himself, and a man who knows because somebody else has seen it and said so out loud. Nora Finn saw it, said so, chose to stay. On the mornings when I come in from the early check and the kitchen's going and I can hear her and the boys before I even open the door, the smell of it, the sounds of it, the particular weight of a house that's full, I know what this place is. I built it. And it's whole.